Taste the Blood of Dracula? No thank you, but I will watch the movie. Hi guys, so before we get into it, a quick reminder that you'll find all my other Hammer reviews in my Hammer playlist, and there will be spoilers today. This movie is old, but still extremely captivating and interesting. This is the 5th film in Hammer's Dracula series, or 6th if you count Kiss of the Vampire, so we're really starting to get through the middle of this series now. All the films up to this point have been absolute gold. I've enjoyed every single one of them, but could that streak continue with Taste the Blood of Dracula? It's certainly a fantastic cast, although in the case of the director, I'd not actually heard of him the other night when I looked him up. His name is Peter Sasdy. To be honest, it was after the film that I looked up who directed this, and I was fully expecting it to turn out to be like Terence Fisher or Freddie Francis, so I was a little bit surprised to see this name I'd never heard of. He was a Hungarian director, and he would go on to do a few other Hammer films, but I think this was his first, although there's nothing out of the ordinary about the way that this film is directed. There's one moment in the middle of it where there's this kind of reverberating effect where the camera sort of goes back and forth on Dracula's servant's body as he's about to turn into Dracula, as you know, the Count is about to be resurrected. I thought that was a clever shot, but by and large, this film is directed sort of by the numbers for the most part. The cast, though, is incredible. We've got Ralph Bates as Dracula's servant, and I like him a lot more in this than I did Horror of Frankenstein, which I watched the other week. I actually wanted to see more of Ralph Bates in this film than I got, because he sadly bows out around about the halfway point, but he does such a theatrical turn in this. I could actually imagine Oliver Reed playing this same part and just scaring the living bejesus out of the 3 middle-aged men that this character starts hanging around with in this, but Bates does a really good job. It's just sad that he dies early, because I really wanted to see him hang around later in the film and be on screen with Christopher Lee's Dracula at the same time. I kind of wanted to see this character, Courtney, I think. I wanted to see him come to the realization that Dracula's not all he's cracked up to be, but sadly I was deprived of that pleasure. We've also got Linda Hayden playing the main glamour girl of the film. Now, I didn't recognise her when I was watching this, but afterwards I realised that she's the same actress who was in a folk horror film called Blood on Satan's Claw. She was a real standout from that film. I saw it a couple of years ago. I guess she's got a slightly different hairdo in this, which is why I didn't recognise her, but she's very, very good and equally adept at playing both the innocent sweet girl and the she-devil vampire killer later in the film. I can absolutely understand why they would have taken her from this and decided it was a good idea to give her that role in Blood on Satan's Claw, albeit it's not a Hammer film. We've also got in this Jeffrey Keane, who I mostly know from the James Bond films. He pops up a lot in the Roger Moore era as either M or somebody on the staff at MI6 headquarters. Usually I know him to be a very sort of firm but nice guy, but in this film he's playing a real villain. It's been really cool. The more films I watch from sort of late 60s, early 70s, I've seen Jeffrey Keane pop up now and again, and it's cool for me to sort of discover him as more than just this one character from the Bond series. We'll say a little bit more about his character in this later on, because he's definitely the secondary villain in this film after Dracula. Mentioning somebody from Bond brings me on to mentioning Madeline Smith, who was a Bond girl in Live and Let Die. She plays that girl who has her dress undone with a magnet. Very memorable stuff. I didn't realise she was in this film. Same with Linda Hayden. I just discovered this after viewing the film. I should really start looking at the cast list and who the director is before I watch these films, and then I can look out for these people as I'm going through the film. But no, I didn't realise it at the time. But apparently, I think she plays one of the strippers in this film for like one scene, maybe. And I guess the last person I'll mention before we get into actually talking about the story and stuff is Michael Ripper, who I am well used to by now popping up in these things. You know, it's got to the point with me and Ripper where when he walks on screen to do his bit, I kind of feel like I'm suddenly in a theatre and I just want to shout out, yay, you know, and maybe Ripper will look at the screen and just wink, breaking the fourth wall as if to say, yep, I'm here to do my part as the bartender or the policeman or whatever. Dracula gets his usual convenient resurrection in this. By this point of these films, seemingly, we know that he's going to come back by some completely nonsensical means, you know, a random ritual, or a drop of his blood will fall on a pentagram, or a bolt of lightning will hit his grave. It doesn't matter at the end of the day, as long as he comes back and we get the film moving again. It would go on to be the same sort of thing in the Nightmare on Elm Street films in the 80s. You know, you get to like the fifth or the sixth one, and they're constantly having to come up with some bullshit reason to bring Freddy back time after time. But if you are a fan of those movies, you won't mind that. And now, I'm not a fan of Nightmare on Elm Street, really, personally, but I am a fan of these Dracula films. So I get to this fifth film, and I'm not bothered, to be honest, what they do to get Dracula back. You know, I can sort of buy into the cheesy fun of it. Actually, the path in the story that leads up to Dracula's resurrection in this is quite well done. So we start off with like this traveling salesman character who gets thrown out of a coach by some really freaky guy. It's a really random moment. We never see this freaky guy again for the rest of the movie. Now, for reasons unknown to me, this salesman, once he's abandoned on the road, he decides to walk through the woods rather than just carry on following the road. I didn't really get that. But eventually he stumbles across Dracula, still in his death throes from the previous movie, which I thought was really neat and unexpected, because I had absolutely expected this salesman to be a sacrificial lamb. Maybe he would die by either Dracula or one of his apostles or something. So this whole opening sequence is really strong. It gets you into the movie. It's full of atmosphere and weird moments and surprises. Absolutely love it. Dracula himself, being played by Christopher Lee as always, it's an absolute paycheck performance by Lee. I mean, he's just putting on the black cloak in this film, biting a couple of people. He's got very, very little to do. He looks mean and nasty. Job done. Go home. He does say 4 or 5 lines, all of which are completely unnecessary. His first line, for instance, the first thing he says in this, he just sort of looks at the camera and says, "I must now go and kill the 3 people who have murdered my manservant." He doesn't say it quite like that, but that's the gist of what he's saying. But when he's saying it, I'm kind of thinking, who are you talking to? You're the only person in this room right now. He's literally just telling the audience what his plans are, but I'm sure we could have sussed that out, or they could have figured out some other physical way of showing us what he intends to do. All of his other lines are unnecessary as well. So he does this thing in this where every time he kills one of the men he's going after, he'll then say the number, sort of the person he's just killed. So after the first guy he kills, he looks at the camera and says, "The first." And then after he kills the second guy, he just goes, "The second." And all through this, I'm sort of grinning and thinking, oh my God, that is so cheesy. And I sort of love it at the same time. His death in this is almost as silly as his resurrection. Seemingly, by this point, they'd not only run out of ways to resurrect him in any serious fashion, but also they'd run out of ways to kill him, which just makes me think, why didn't they just have him escape at the end of some of these films? And then you would sort of kill 2 birds with the same stone. His death, well, before I talk about his death, I've just got to sort of backtrack a little bit to how Courtly resurrects him in the first place. I don't get why Courtly decides to perform the ritual with the goblets and the blood in a church. He deliberately picks out a church, but why? Because Dracula hates anything that's holy, so surely this is a terrible place to bring Dracula back. And even when Dracula is back, he then continues to make the church his base of operations. He doesn't go anywhere else, so there's all these convenient things lying around that could kill him later in the film, like crosses and what have you. And that's indeed what happens at the end. Like the main guy who's left starts holding up crosses, and Dracula's like flinching away. And at that point, I'm just thinking how easy it would actually be to kill Dracula if that works. But then Dracula sort of makes to escape. He goes high up in like the church rafters. He's about to go through a window, I think, but then he turns back around for some reason. I don't know why, and looks back into the church, and he starts seeing crosses all over the place. He even starts seeing crosses that aren't really crosses. They're just sort of objects that you could make into crosses with your eyes if you look at them in a certain direction when lined up against other objects sort of thing. And it's like the power of all these crosses suddenly is too much for him, and he dies and does like a swan dive down into the church. It's just silly. It just makes him look like the softest vampire in the whole world, that he could just die outright like this. But I mean, when I witnessed this happening in the film, I did think that it was completely and utterly stupid, and yet depressingly also cheesily brilliant. I'm not sure where this film is meant to be set. All the previous ones take place in mainland Europe or Germany, but in this one I started to wonder whether the action had moved to England, and the script just isn't very explicit about it, because at one point there's a really clumsy reference to the East End. So I don't know. Are we in England in this film or mainland Europe still? Do let me know in the comments if you've got any input on that. It's not an important point, but I'm just the sort of person who gets OCD when it comes to knowing where a story is set. And if a script doesn't point it out or make it obvious, then it does kind of plague me a little bit. Getting back to the story, Hammer were clearly not interested at this point in the series of taking the Dracula character any more forwards than they already had. They weren't interested in giving him more personality or showing his backstory, and I'm fine with that, because there's no need to ruin the character by doing that. But by keeping Dracula so simple in these films and so scarce, they had to put in these other side plots just to fill out the runtime, and that's what you get in this film and the previous one as well. Dracula has risen from the grave, and I think in the Frankenstein series there was a film that was sort of similar, Frankenstein Created Woman. It had this whole other plot almost, and then it sort of merged with Frankenstein and his latest monster sort of near the end. So in this film we get this almost like a side story involving this girl Alice, played by Linda Hayden, and her boyfriend Paul. They basically love each other, but they can never really meet because Alice has got this overprotective father played by Jeffrey Keane. So she's always having to sort of try and sneak out at night to try and meet up with Paul. He's a really horrible father, this guy, who tries to keep her locked up all the time. He constantly slags her off if she shows any interest in boys. Like, there's this one scene really early on where Alice basically just smiles in a friendly way to Paul at church. And later on, her father really admonishes her for that. He's like, how dare you do that really slutty, over-sexualized behavior in a house of the Lord? You know, he's acting like they've been sat on a pew at the back, like touching each other up and taking each other's clothes off or something. All she did was smile at him outside the church, and he reacts like that. And yet at the same time, he's leading this double life where he goes off to brothels and sleeps with women. In fact, it's sort of hinted that he's done that much sleeping around that he's bored of it now. Just a really hypocritical guy. The scenes where Paul meets up with Alice, they can get a little bit mushy, and I think in any other film I would sort of be a bit embarrassed at some of the dialogue that's been put in here, but it kind of fits with the overall tone of the film and how so many parts of it are quite cheesy, but they're doing all these really corny lines like, oh, Paul, tell me you'll never stop loving me, and stuff like that. But I don't mind it in this film. It didn't make me feel awkward at all. It didn't make me feel like, oh God, just skip to the next scene. I didn't mind it. When I was watching this film the other night, my wife was sat in the corner just out of view of the TV. She was just playing on her phone. She's got no interest in watching Dracula films. But when these Paul and Alice scenes were on screen, I kept thinking any moment now she's going to put the phone down and look up at the TV and say, what the hell is this romantic shit that you're watching? But she never did. I guess she's probably got too used to me sort of watching Hammer films. But the whole Alice plot and the way that it's driven forward, I think it really does make you like that character, and it really makes you like Paul as well. So I think it's all done very well, and the behaviour of this father character, you really feel like you want him to get his comeuppance in this, and in the end it's a little bit of a surprise actually that it comes so early. He's the first person to die out of his trio of three. You'd think they would have left him until last, but they don't. I'm also surprised, as I've already said, that Ralph Bates' character departs early. So there's quite a few little surprises in this film that I really did appreciate as I was going through it. So I'm just trying to think if there's anything left to add, really. There's nothing in the soundtrack of this film that stood out for me. Production design, locations, and set design is all fine, though. Although one thing I noticed is that there's no big grand castle set in this film like what you get in some of the earlier films like Brides of Dracula, Horror of Dracula, etc. I think in the previous one before this as well, there was a castle, but you only saw it from the outside, I think, if memory serves. But the story doesn't really need a Dracula's castle in this one. And certainly the fact that they don't have big, lavish sets like that probably would have helped keep the cost down a little bit. But overall, I thoroughly enjoyed this film. For me, this does keep the streak going. Every film in this series so far has been extremely good. how long can this go on for? Surely at some point there will be a Dracula film done by Hammer that I don't like. But for now, we move on. I'll quickly show you the version of the film that I've got for this on Blu-ray. Here is my copy of Taste the Blood of Dracula. It's an immaculate remaster. It doesn't have anything in the way of features, sadly, unless you count the theatrical trailer. I don't really watch trailers if they're put onto Blu-rays or DVDs. Let's get to the bag of terror then and find out what sort of score I'm going to give this movie. Today's score is sponsored by Cucumber, as all my scores are. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 bloody axes out of 5. An excellent score. I think that's the same score that I gave to the previous Dracula film. If all the films can keep this going, I'll be more than happy. Right, I'll leave it there for today. I'll be back soon to do another Hammer review. I'm thinking my next one will just divert into the realm of fantasy. I've ordered a copy of Vengeance of She, the sequel to She. If that doesn't turn up in the post in time, I might consider doing Blood from the Mummy's Tomb, or whatever the fourth and final Mummy film is called. I've already got that one on the shelf, I just haven't watched it yet. But for now, I will bid you adieu. So, adieu.